introduce our theme and remind some of you that have already been introduced to it what we're doing this year, and those who are new on this call, you're very welcome. It's lovely to see you. Maybe you wonder what on earth this title, Working from Rest, means. After all, we're much more familiar with the idea of resting from work, aren't we? That's kind of the way we normally regard our weekends or our day off, is resting from work. We're shattered. We want to just crash out and put our feet up and recover. But is that kind of sufficient from a Christian perspective? Could we swing the whole thing round and think about rest as a way of receiving from God all the resourcing that we need for the work ahead? And remarkably, this is what we see in the creation account of Adam and Eve being created on the 6th day. So their first day is actually a day of rest. So they rest to work. How about we try and see work, which this project, Faith in Business, is focused on work. So why are we talking about rest? Well, we are talking about work, but what would work feel like and look like and be like for those that we work with if we were to be working from the rest that God gives? And God does give that rest. And in Jesus, we have his amazing promise of if we come to him, if we're heavy laden, he will give us rest. And in Hebrews, we find that this rest is given to all believers, that we enter into God's rest by coming to faith in Jesus. So we are a people who have been given rest, and the life beyond this life is talked about in Scripture as rest. There's also evidence that we'll be doing some form of work, but principally it is rest. And if we're working, it'll be working from that rest. So we have rest in Jesus, and we have a rest to look forward to in the life beyond this life. So in the sense that the kingdom is here, even though it's not here in its fullness, how can we already anticipate and enter that rest, even in the hugely hectic lives that we live in our contemporary culture, which is so driven? I don't need to convince any of you that working life is hard. It's pressurized, it's stressful, it's long hours, and it can mean a lot of neglect to other things that are important in life. Good. I think that's all I need to say to put out the playing field, and the players are now invited onto the pitch. I don't know which of you have decided to go first, but whoever goes first, if you could then just hand over straight to the one who's decided to go second. And I'll also ask you, Cara and Curt, to introduce yourselves. I don't know Curt personally, but I do know Cara personally, even though she's right on the other side of the world, that we have done a couple of things in Oxford, and I think we've done some stuff at Gordon Conwell as well in the States. So we've had various things that we've collaborated on, mainly through Ken Barnes, who's a mutual friend and colleague of ours, who's actually traveling down under at this very moment, and that's why he's not on the call. But we're so delighted with this partnership with Ken's group that Cara's part of in the Mockler Centre in Gordon Conwell. And we feel enriched by the seminars we've had. If this is your first one, do go back and look at the videos of these previous ones, because they've been really, really rich. And we look forward to another rich session now. So over to you guys. As you know, you've only got 6 minutes, but there'll be time afterwards, plenty of time for questions and answers. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Greetings, everyone, from Sydney, Australia. It's a little bit late and it's also summer here. So I'm going to go redder and redder and probably drooping the eyes as we go on. Yes, my name's Cara Martin. I am author of a couple of books on faith work. Workship is the term that I sort of coined, that integration of work and worship. I also lecture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary with Ken Barnes in leadership and we've got a intensive coming up on how do you manage change and conflict. I also lecture for a couple of other colleges in Australia and other places. But yeah, it's an absolute delight to be part of this. It all came about because there was an invitation from Ken to be part of a book on Sabbath. And yeah, the title that I was invited, well, I think I actually put my hand up for this one, and I'm going to share screen as I talk about this, was to talk about Sabbath as reimagination. Now, if I say the word Sabbath, I wonder what word comes to mind as you think about that. Maybe there's some of the words that Peter has already mentioned. The sorts of words that I immediately thought of were words like time. We think of Sabbath as a time period, whether it's a day in 7 or some other combination. We might think of it as rest. Peter mentioned the Sabbath rest that's talked about in Hebrews 4 that I'll point to later as well. So this idea of rest, of course, is a part of it. And worship. We often worship God on the Sabbath. We gather to worship. So it's a natural connection to have those 3 words as part of what we think about when we talk about Sabbath. But in this idea of reimagination and creating sacred spaces, I actually came up with some other concepts looking at the Bible and how it talks about Sabbath. So as well as time, I realized that Sabbath can also be about place as well, that in the Bible, God is always concerned about place. So how could we talk about Sabbath not just as time, but also think about it in terms of place? As well as rest, what about the concept of contemplation? The first Sabbath was, of course, when God rested, but he didn't need to rest because he was tired, as we might need to rest. What was he doing there? I suspect he was contemplating, reflecting on his work. And as well as worship, there was this concept also that Sabbath can be a time of encountering God in such a way as we begin to reimagine our life and work. It gives us an opportunity to do that. Now, as part of these chapters, we were asked to write these chapters from the perspective of our vocation. And so we had a lawyer thinking about Sabbath from the perspective of being a lawyer. We had a theologian thinking about it from that perspective, a philosopher. But I wrote about it from the perspective of a writer because that's my vocation. And I decided to think about writing and story and where Sabbath comes to play in that. And to get inspiration, I turned to Lord of the Rings, one of my favorite books. Maybe you've read the book, maybe you've seen the films, but I was interested in seeing how writers actually use Sabbath. And Sabbath is a natural part of story. You have periods of activity and you have periods where there's a rest period where special things happen. So I looked at Lord of the Rings just at the first book, Fellowship of the Ring, and there were actually 3 Sabbath moments in the first book. The first one is in the place of Tom Bombadil, the house of Tom Bombadil, which isn't in the movie. So yes, get that out of the way. That's very annoying. The second one is Rivendell, which is in the movie, a beautiful place with waterfalls and so on. And then there's a time in Lothlorien with the Wood Elves, and that is where they encounter the Lady Galadriel, played by Cate Blanchett. Maybe you remember that part. Now, I'm not going to be able to talk too much about Lord of the Rings or Tolkien or those Sabbaths right now because we only have 6 minutes, but please ask questions if you want to know more and I can wax lyrical a bit later on that. But just in case you thought all my theology came from Lord of the Rings, and I don't think that's entirely wrong, by the way, but I also want to sort of talk about some of the biblical basis for this as well. So in Deuteronomy 5:12-15, we have a restating of the command to Sabbath. God is commanding his people to take a Sabbath break. And in that restating, he talks about rest not only for the people, but for their servants and for their livestock. So Sabbath is actually expanded to creation as well, to animals and creation. And at the end of that passage, it says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt and the Lord your God brought you out. Now, if you think about being a slave, slaves do not have the opportunity of Sabbathing. They have no choice about that. And so what God is actually asking the people to do is reimagine work. He's creating this opportunity for them to see what a privilege it is to have this work-rest continuum, that this is the way that we're meant to be in this rhythm of working and resting. But they're going to have to imagine what that could be like because they've been slaves and they haven't been accustomed to that. Peter talked about Hebrews 4:9-10, and there is in that passage this idea of the Sabbath rest, which is linked to salvation, but also looks ahead as well to the new creation, this idea of a Sabbath rest where it's actually being in the presence of God. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So there's this sort of looking forward and imagination about it. And then in Revelation 21, 3-4, we have this amazing image of what it's going to be like in the new creation, that God will actually dwell with us. It will be that dwelling with God Sabbath time. And it talks about this idea, you might remember in the sort of extended passage, it talks about no more pain, no more mourning, no more tears. And it says, for the old order of things has passed away. So there's an invitation there to think about the new order. What is the new order going to be like? And for where we are, for where we're living in the now and the not yet, there's an opportunity and an invitation to actually think about that new order into the very lives that we're living now and the lives that we're working in now. So how do we do that? How do we reimagine? What are some of the practical ways that we can do that? Here are 4 things that I can encourage you to do. Sometimes I use them in my coaching or mentoring when we're helping people to reimagine their life or their work from God's perspective. So the first one is creativity. It's amazing what happens when you put a nice packet of colored pencils in front of people and some blank paper. There's an invitation to creatively engage with what this might look like. And if drawing's not your thing, then I always have Play-Doh as well. Or plasticine, so people can mold and sculpt things as well. So creativity unlocks our imaginations in a special way. The next thing is curiosity, asking questions. We all get sort of upset when we have a small child who is always asking why, but we need that sort of curiosity to enter into this world of reimagining. Why do things have to be that way? Why can't we look outside of this position that we're in, this area that in this way of thinking? How can we break free of that? So curiosity is great for imagination. I've already talked about God's word and some of the images that God has in his word that can inspire us, but doing this with God in prayer is absolutely essential. And the last idea is grace. I think grace breaks us out of some of those dominant sort of themes that are in our world, the dominant possibilities. Because of grace, because of unearned grace from God, we can actually lean into grace and experience imagination and experience our world in a different way. Now, I know my 6 minutes are almost up, so I want to close with this quote that came fortuitously to me in the last couple of weeks. It was written by Paul Woolley from the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. And in it, he's quoting John Koestler's book, and he talks about how Sabbath affords a rest by which we are not so much restored as restoried. And you can see how this links to some of my themes about literature and writing and so on. And then Paul goes on to say, in the biblical narrative, Sabbath displaces work from the center of human life and invites us to reimagine a world that is centered around the God who made it. In taking rest seriously, we are not only refreshed, but restoried with a true account of God, the world, and ourselves. That is the sort of imagination that I think we need. Imagination, the opportunity to rest and reimagine what our lives and our work would look like if God was at the center of them. How would it be different? What could we challenge? What opportunities would there be? I think that's a beautiful way of thinking of writing God back into the center of the story where he's been all along, actually, but maybe just taking apart the layers that are over the top to uncover God at the center of the story. That's all I have for you now. I hope you've had some questions as I've been speaking. I look forward to engaging with those. But now I want to stop sharing and invite Curt to talk to you all.
Thank you, Kara, very much. Yeah, greetings from Windsor, where I'm based. I see today is a day of non-British accents, so it's great to have the Kara and Curt combo. I am a tech chairman and a CEO, and I'm here as a part of stewardship, where I am a trustee. It's really lovely being here today, meeting you all, and seeing those that we know each other already. But why is rest so relevant today in business? A pastor on the west coast of the U.S. by the name of John Mark Comer talks about how our current context is afflicted by screens, the massive onslaught of the digital age, loneliness, secularism, and this insane pace of hurry and busyness that a lot of us struggle with. There was a BuzzFeed article a few years ago talking about how burnout is a rite of passage for millennials. And so that is something to be thought about, that, burnout is just seeing, that's normal for everyone. And we have, in many ways, become a burnout society that's based on being an achievement society, where we have more opportunity to reach full potential than at any other point in history. Yet at the same time, mental illness is through the roof. And even though it is crippling at a soul level, many people get their identity from their performance, from their work, from their achievement. So in today's context, practices of solitude, silence, prayer, deep relational connection, and following the way of Jesus are needed more than ever. And as Christians in business, I think we're in the translation business. We are here to translate Christian doctrine into the way we do business, and in a way that's not imposing, but that is motivating. And we need to actively translate, in a missional sense, the doctrine of rest into our business lives. And it is, as we all know, the opposite of anxiety and fear, which really are the ruling spirits of our age in the office. And I can really think, rest has to be one of the most relevant Christian doctrines that we can really bring to work today, right now. So my question and my challenge to you and to me is, why can't your office be your sacred place? Why can't your front line, to use a London Institute of Contemporary Christianity term, why can't your front line be a sacred place of rest? We all know that connecting with God on a mountaintop is a lot easier than in a Regis office somewhere. But it is important, I think, that we can actually find rest at the office and be agents of rest at the office. And just a couple things, a couple thoughts. And in the email that came out earlier this week announcing this session, it quoted from 1 Kings chapter 8. And I would really encourage you to look at verses 56 and 63 and meditate on that, because we can learn some things about rest from that, about being present to God, about being obedient, about being a steward. And I think that the concept of rest can be best summed up in one word, and finding rest at the office, and that's the word shalom. Dietrich Schindler, who's a church planner in Germany, talks about how shalom, he defines it as a holistic well-being that cannot be lost. He calls it the good life. It's the good life that goes into eternity. And so how many of you would define your office as the good life, or a place of holistic well-being where it can't be lost? Often offices are just the opposite of that. And so I encourage you to reimagine your place of work, your office, as a sacred place of rest, where there is godly management of anxiety and fear, because, let's face it, they are realities of our lives, where we can see God's impact on our daily tasks. So if we think about Proverbs 16, where it talks about we can make our plans, and God, I think, wants us to make plans and to strategize, but the Lord determines our steps. And so each day, as we walk through our day, through our meetings and our tasks, praying through those, and just generally following Jesus' example, following his practice of shalom, solitude, silence, prayer, and deep relational connection. So the questions I have for myself and for you is, are you being an advocate of rest at your place of work? Are you being shalom to your colleagues? Are you offering a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? Do you feel the peace and rest of God by leaning on one another and by navigating your relationships with wisdom and tact? Or are you succumbing to relating to others in a worldly and anxious way, using jealousy, ambition, recognition, aggressiveness, belittlement, self-promotion, pride, etc.? So I encourage you to practice shalom, this holistic well-being that cannot be lost, and really to think, can I find this in my office, and how can I make some steps there today? As I close, I just want to read to you a couple verses from this great hymn I just sang on Sunday, so I thought it was brilliant. We Rest on Thee. This is 2 verses from the contemporary version. It says, this great song says, we rest in you, our shield and our defender. We do not fight alone against the foe. Strong in your strength, safe in your keeping tender, we rest in you, and in your name we go. We go in faith, our own great weakness feeling, and needing more each day your grace to know. Yet from our hearts a triumph pealing, we rest in you, and in your name we go. Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, Curt, that's great. And thanks, Cara. Those are 2 great talks. And it's wonderful too, because both Curt and Cara represent our partners. Curt through the stewardship, which is partnering with us this year on this theme, and will be partnering for the retreat.
How do we promote? How do we reinvent? I know it's modeling, but outside modeling it in our own lives, which is enough of a challenge, how else can we direct people to the Christian faith as a place of rest?
I think there's a massive tradition of spiritual practices of rest. Curt mentioned quite a few of them that have been practiced for more than 2,000 years and modeled by Jesus. And then we see hints of them in the Old Testament as well. So there's a long, long tradition in the Christian world of practices that encourage rest. In Australia, I was really encouraged just before the end of last year that one of our organisations was contacted by the Guardian newspaper, which I know you have in England, with the journalists asking, want to know if we knew anyone who practiced Sabbath in their organisation, because they said they knew Sabbath had something to do with the Bible. And they were just asking if we knew anyone who knew what that was about. And we were able to put them in touch with a lawyer who actually practices Sabbath in his practice, encourages all his people to practice Sabbath as well, and has rest practices as a rhythm through their day. But it was interesting that came from a secular newspaper and a media organization. I found it really encouraging, because I think there is a hunger for this rest, and I think actually the pandemic sort of grew that hunger even more. You have in our society a practice that's quite popular at the moment called quiet quitting, where people are refusing to work longer than is required or demanded in their actual contract for their employment. They don't want to give more than they have to. And I think that's, I don't think that's healthy in some ways, because it's almost, it's almost like, well, I guess it's a movement of people trying to take power back to themselves, the employees, and refuse to be exploited. But it actually speaks about the fact that we don't have these rhythms of rest and work, right? That there needs to be more focus on that, and a better way of actually explaining what it looks like and modeling what it looks like, as you say. So one person came to me, she was saying, how do you rest when she was talking as an accountant with the end of month and the end of the financial year and the pressure that's on. How did she take a Sabbath at those periods? Because it would seem like she was abandoning her team. And I said, this might be wrong to say, but I said to her, actually, I think you need to be with your team there. But I think what you need to say to your team is that they need to have rest after this time of extreme busyness, that we need to actually put that into some of the practices of how we work. That if we do have times of intensity and busyness, that we actually have times of rest as well.